Something about me you find interesting?
Yes.
Want to tell me?
No?
Then stop staring at me before I take your eyes out.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818, which many say is based on the Jewish legend of the Golem, is often called the first science fiction novel. Others give that status to Margaret Cavendish's 17th century satirical utopian novel, The Blazing World. Either way, we have women at the very beginning of science fiction and fantasy. And of course, other women have made genre-defining and redefining contributions ever since. This includes today's guest.
We're honored to chat with Esther Friesner, a prolific and award-winning science fiction and fantasy author known for her humorous style and thematic focus on gender equality and social justice. Her many books include Nobody's Princess, Sphinx's Princess, the Chicks in Chainmail series, and Threads and Flames, a YA novel about a Jewish girl caught up in the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Esther, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Hi, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Your first story, The Stuff of Heroes, was published in 1982. Since then, you've published over 40 novels and hundreds of short stories, poems, and articles. What drew you to creative writing and sci-fi and fantasy in particular?
I knew I wanted to be a writer from the time I was 3, and because I loved stories. And I thought, well, I wonder what I could write that would appeal to people. And so I decided to try writing a little bit of everything, sending it off, and seeing what happened. And the first thing I sold, aside from a couple of nonfiction articles, was that story. And so I decided, well, the dice have rolled. I am meant to be a science fiction writer. The funny thing is, when I was trying to get published at first, I came this close to selling a murder mystery novel. It was very funny, though, because the letter I got back from the publisher said, well, we had 3 editors, 2 out of 3 said, oh, yes, let's do it. The 3rd one didn't, but we think you're another Dick Francis. And I proved why I shouldn't have been a mystery writer, because I turned to my husband and said, who's Dick Francis? So it's fate, but it's really fun fate. One of my friends in grad school is actually how I started doing fantasy novels. She came to the lunch table. She had a ton of notes on legal pads. And we said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm building a world. And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. I'm going to try to build a world. And apparently I've built several.
Early in your career, you also had an advice column, Ask Auntie Esther, in Pulp House magazine. What did that entail?
Well, I decided to give advice because I think I have Yenta genes somewhere in there. And I like telling people what to do and how to run their lives. But the funny thing was, because a lot of people have problems with science fiction and fantasy as genres. And I thought, well, perhaps I can help them understand. And when the column first came out, I said, please send in your questions. I will answer them. And no one sent in anything. So I pretty much wrote the questions and the answers. I don't know if you call that a closed circuit, but I had fun, so who cares?
I think that happens more often than readers realize, that the questions, even as the advice person is trying to write in a different style, you can kind of tell that they're writing questions for themselves. And, these are the questions I wish someone would ask me. So you were kind of in that situation as well, it sounds.
Exactly. But I did have a lot of fun doing that. Fun is kind of one of the main reasons I enjoy writing so much. If it's not going to be fun, I can be doing a host of other things. It's not quite like Marie Kondo and Does It Spark Joy, but I will say this, that writing for me, from the time I was too young to write down the stories that I told and that my mother would transcribe for me, it has always been a source of joy to me.
The About the Author section of your 1994 Star Trek Deep Space Nine novel, War Child, notes that you were severely criticized by your first college English teacher for choosing Star Trek as a subject for expository writing. How has this elitist attitude towards Star Trek and other pop culture properties, and maybe sci-fi and fantasy in general, changed over the years?
That teacher, his exact words, we had to do a piece for creative writing, which I have learned that in some places is not an oxymoron. I don't know, but the two don't jibe, creative and writing, in courses at least my old college. But I described, our first assignment was describe a place on campus. I described the television room in my dormitory when all of us got together to watch Star Trek. I went to Vassar undergrad. At the time, Vassar was still not co-ed. And so you have all these women in a TV room watching Star Trek and being delightfully snarky about the whole thing and having a great, great, great time. And he looked at me and he said, "Miss Friesner, I don't think writing about Star Trek is something a Vassar girl should be doing." And that was why I donated a copy of my first Star Trek novel to the Vassar College Library.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
So that, I think, maybe was pervasive in those days in terms of literary people having an attitude, a certain attitude towards science fiction and certainly pop culture. That seems to have changed over the years, and you've been a large part of that process. You've seen how college courses are now built around things like Star Trek and science fiction and so forth. What do you account for that change in the culture?
It's not that there wasn't interest and readership and movies and such in the genre, but that people got a message from society at large that, oh my God, you read that stuff? What are you, 12?
My quite negative reaction to the prevalence of the Harry Potter books, which seemed to me rubbish, only good for the dustbin, where they will certainly wind up.
And I did not really grasp this until when I wrote my first Star Trek novel. Suddenly, all of these businessmen and women that we knew, who probably back then were fans, but wouldn't say it, were just so thrilled. You write Star Trek? Oh my God, you have to put me in the book, please. I did put a couple of them in the book. So it became more mainstreamed. It was, something you did under the covers with a flashlight back in the day. Oh, and being a woman and liking it. I got the social message when I was growing up, not from my parents. My parents didn't care what I read as long as I read. They didn't care if I was reading science fiction, fantasy, whatever. They were happy with, she's reading. That's great. Would you like some more comic books, dear? They enabled the whole comic book thing for me. My father would come home and go, so shall we go buy you some more comic books? You know, this was at a time when, again, out in society, it was comic books are undoing the youth of America. And, well, I guess I'm pretty well undone at this point. But I wonder if it wasn't the fact that visual media started doing, well, Star Trek. And then, where were you when the first Star Wars movie happened? And the creators, the screenwriters, the producers, the directors started to treat science fiction and fantasy as what it had always been in the literature, serious stories, instead of Plan 9 from outer space. There were the occasional little flashes of serious science fiction in the movie, you know, The Day the Earth Stood Still. And if you paid attention to the subtext of the original Godzilla, oh my God, what it was saying. But then you got Star Wars, you got Star Trek, you got, well, I have never worked in Hollywood, but I've been told the message you get if you want to be successful is, okay, that sold big. Let's do the exact same thing, only different. And also, money gets a lot of respect in our society. Whether or not it deserves it, I couldn't say. But you notice that movies like Star Wars, the first one, they made a lot of money. And people do tend, to some degree, to pay attention when something is earning big.
Well, I actually have a sizable collection of Star Trek novels, I'm proud to admit, and I've read most of them too, including both of yours, War Child and To Storm Heaven, a Star Trek The Next Generation story. I sometimes dream of writing a Star Trek book myself. It might be different now than it was back in the 90s, but what was the process of pitching the idea, following the publishing guidelines, complying with the rules of the franchises, and so on?
My career has had things happen backwards from the way it's supposed to be. I think I was at a science fiction convention, and the editor of the Star Trek line came over to me and said, how would you like to write a Star Trek book? Have you ever watched it? Yes, the original series. When it came out, I still have my Mr. Spock poster. So I was solicited. Now, I don't know whether they are or are not taking unsolicited proposals, but he did tell me that what you should do, there were certain points you had to hit, like make sure all of the major characters have a role. And he asked to see what I was thinking of doing. And I'm sorry I did not get to do an original series one. Although it's probably a good thing, because when I was in college, I wrote fanfic. I wrote some really terrible Star Trek fanfic, and I'm not ashamed. But that was how it happened for me. I suggest you go online and see what they said, because all of your answers are online, young Padawan. And then I guess the first one worked all right, and they asked if I wanted to do a second. One of my best times, though, was in the Star Trek The Next Generation. They gave you, a little humor, leeway. So I gave Worf's son, Alexander, a pet hamster because I wanted to see how Klingons would interact with hamsters. No, he didn't eat it, but he puts his hand in the cage. You know, you read it. The hamster latches on, and then he puts it down. He says, "This is an honorable beast who attacks me. Your name shall be Tribble, who battles with honor." And ever after that, people came up and said, "You gave a Klingon a hamster. You gave a Klingon a hamster," etc.
I love that part of the book because, as you're alluding to, the Tribbles are like the arch nemesis of the Klingons. And here's another thing that's kind of like a Tribble, but an honorable one. It's just so beautiful.
Yes, exactly. Well, every book can be a toy chest, and they're all my toys. I get to play with them and I get to share them.
You also wrote the novelization of the movie Men in Black 2. What's that process like?
Well, again, I was contacted. Well, for something like that, you'd have to be contacted because who's going to, send in a thing for a movie they haven't even seen yet? And so the process was they sent me the script, and I read the script, and I was supposed to stay close to the script. And in the process of finishing it, changes happened in the script, and I was told, and I rewrote, and that was that. Turned it in. Then I went to the movies.
So I know that the process of writing a novelization happens concurrently with the filming, as you're alluding to. Did you get any access to the dailies or any images from the film?
None of I saw nothing but the script. I mean, that would have been cool if I could have, seen the dailies, and that would mean going to LA, and that would have been super cool.
Yeah, it just seems so difficult to imagine what eventually you'll be seeing on the screen and then comparing what you wrote to what you saw and maybe seeing something very different.
That's true, but again, they kept me up to date. I wanted them to be happy, and I guess they were.
Your writing often questions tropes about women and feminists in particular. Could you share some examples?
Well, first of all, and I also use humor. I am a feminist, and it's very funny because even without the label of feminism, I came from a home where, women were treated equally. My father did chores, and I just thought, this is how it is everywhere. And when I finally realized that, no, this is not what every other man does. My mother never did any of the vacuuming. He did it all. She never did any of the laundry. He did that all. And I finally said, "Dad, what?" And he said, "Your mother has a full-time job outside the house, and it wouldn't be fair to have her have to do all of the housework." And he wasn't from the United States originally. He was from Poland. And so he was old country, but he still thought it wasn't fair for a woman who was holding down a job to have to do everything in the house on top of that. So that's what I grew up with. And as I was getting more and more into reading fantasy at that time back then, maybe it was just my reading of things, but it struck me that in the books, in the fantasy books, women were either being treated as objects to be rescued so the hero could show how heroic he was. But you also had women warriors. And a lot of the women warriors, I'm sure not all, but I didn't read everything, had a bit of a chip on their shoulder sometime. And I looked at this and I thought about this and I said, I think we need some middle ground here. And I was wandering around an art show, and I was in the art show with my friends, and they were criticizing a painting. The painting had a woman in the typical chainmail bikini. You know how all the illustrations were. Chainmail bikini, and she was holding a sword and shield and fighting something in the painting. But the way she was holding the sword and shield, it was, oh, honey, no, you have no decent armor, and you're holding yourself totally vulnerable. So while they're debating this, I'm wandering through the art show thinking about, for some reason, and I don't know why, my muse is a terrible creature, I was thinking about old movies and some of the stranger genres of old movies. Are you at all familiar with the old women in prison movies?
Yeah, Caged Heat and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, you can still see that parodied on RuPaul's Drag Race occasionally. But I was looking at this and thinking about those things, and maybe I could do a science fiction spin on that. What would we call it? Maybe Babes Behind Bars. And then, for some reason, something clicked up here, and I went from that alliteration to Chicks in Chainmail. Funny stories about women warriors. And I ran back to my friends and I said, Chicks in Chainmail. And of course, they looked at me funny. Then I spoke to an editor at Bain Books and I told her the idea. Because you know what? A lot of people, the joke is feminists don't have a sense of humor. That is not true. Oh, that is so not true. As I pointed out in the first introduction, we can take a joke. You have to be strong to take a joke, but we don't take cheap shots. And the first book came out, and a lot of the male writers did not approach me about writing for it. They said later, well, we were afraid we'd get in trouble if we did that. And later they got over this, and suddenly everybody wanted to be in the Chicks in Chainmail series. The beauty of the internet. I get an email from this man that says, I'm in New Zealand, and they just opened a Barnes & Noble in Wellington, and I found your Chicks in Chainmail book. I think it was the second one, which you dedicated in this long poem to Lucy Lawless from Xena. I am a stuntman on Xena, and you say in the introduction you'd love to have an autographed photo of her signed to Binky. And was just like a silly thing. Would you like this? I will get this from her for you. Well, he was on the level. And I now have in this house an autographed photograph of Lucy Lawless as Xena, which she signed for me and for my daughter and for Binky, because, well, bad girls go everywhere.
I was going to ask you about Xena Warrior Princess, because it seems like that show in particular resonated with feminists who had a sense of humor. It was kind of a revision of that damsel in distress and the ill-equipped warrior. It was really that kind of middle ground that you're talking about.
Oh, yes. And a lot of the later episodes got kind of grim, but they always manage to keep the sense of humor. And you know what? Frankly, speaking as a Jew, humor has been one of our survival mechanisms. It really has. In some of the darkest times and the darkest places in our history, humor has saved us. Well, at least kept us going, you know?
There have been many Jewish science fiction and fantasy authors, including many of the pioneers and leading names of these genres. Do you see any historical or cultural reasons why Jews have been so prominent in creating sci-fi and fantasy?
We have been forced into the role of the underdog. And as Walt Kelly said, everyone loves the underdog as long as he stays the underdog. But part of being the underdog is you can write your own world where the underdog rises. In fact, that's actually not just in Jewish culture, but it's also in, well, look at a lot of fairy tales where the youngest son or the despised stepchild rises. So superheroes, and of course everyone knows about Superman coming from two Jewish creators. Well, superheroes are underdogs who rise. Superman is a refugee. He has been not just lost where his country was, he has lost his whole world. And sometimes when the hero, who is the underdog, who everyone thinks of as the easy target, sometimes he doesn't have superpowers and he still rises. Now, this is going to make it a little hard to work with Batman because financially he's nothing near being an underdog. But he is because, well, he was emotionally scarred down to the bone by losing his parents the way he did. And he is not a hero with superpowers, but he also manages to pick himself up. And I can't say get over it because that's improper terminology, but to rise and to conquer to a degree. And then, because the underdog knows the pain of being persecuted and being underestimated and being pushed down, they don't just, underdogs, good superheroes, they don't just take the powers that are given to them, they use them for others. And I think there's a lot of that in our culture. You know, remember, you were oppressed in Egypt, and do not oppress the stranger.
Are you working on any news stories?
I work on several different things at the same time. So right now I am writing a very darker take on Frankenstein. I am writing a funny story about a golem in Brooklyn, based on my old neighborhood, which I also used in the past in a vampire story during one of the, a Jewish family cousins club thing. It's called Benny Comes Home, and he's come back from World War II, and he's come back with this guy. Anyway, hijinks and vampires ensue. So I've got those. I'm working on an Arthurian novel that I had started years ago and put to one side, and I think that's going to be quite good. Let me see, what else? My goodness, I have a lot. Oh, I'm also working on a ghost story about the ghosts of the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. You know, they used to get the tax collectors and tar and feather them. It's an interesting chapter in American history. Don't tax booze. This is what will happen. And I think I'm probably doing more things. I'll know as soon as I reopen my Word file. And right now, coming up soon, I sold a story to fantasy and science fiction magazine. It is called Dog People, and it is involving Greek gods, the return of the dead, and tea at the Plaza Hotel.
That all sounds really terrific. Thanks so much, Esther, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.